During the frigid season, it's often necessary to nestle under the blanket to try and stay warm. The temperature difference between the blanket and the air outside is so palpable, like so discernible, so something that you can very clearly see or feel rather, that we often have trouble leaving our warm refuge. Or I can definitely accept that, right? It's very hard to get out of bed when it's cold outside. Many plants and animals similarly hunker down, relying on snow cover for safety from winter's harsh conditions. So, this paragraph started by talking about blankets, and then it moved on to talking about animals and plants, right? What is the difference here? Now, if you notice, he says similarly hunker down. So he's making a comparison. Just like when it's cold, we want to go under a blanket to stay warm. Plants and animals go under the snow in order to stay warm. That's what he's trying to say here. The small area between the snowpack and the ground, called the subnivium, so now we know the name for it, might be the most important ecosystem that you have never heard of. So it's something that you have never heard of, which means not a lot of people know about it, but it's very important. The subnivium is so well insulated and stable that its temperature holds steady at around 32 degrees Fahrenheit, just 0 degrees Celsius. So he uses a comparison in the first paragraph to introduce the concept of subnivium that we have never heard of, but is an important ecosystem. And now he's going to explain to us probably what is the subnivium and why it is an important ecosystem. Starts off by saying that it's well insulated and stable. Although that might still sound cold, it does because it's 0 degrees. A constant temperature of 32 degrees Fahrenheit can often be 30 to 40 degrees warmer than the air temperature during the peak of winter. So one advantage is that it's a constant temperature and it is still 30 to 40 degrees warmer than the air outside. Because of this large temperature difference, a wide variety of species depend on the subnivium for winter protection. And that's why it is an important ecosystem. For many organisms living in temperate and Arctic regions, the difference between being under the snow or outside it is a matter of life and death. So it's extremely important for them, right, that they go under and burrow into the snow. Consequently, disruptions to the subnivium brought about by climate change will affect everything from population dynamics to nutrient cycling through the ecosystem. So now we are having a small shift in the direction. We are not, the point of this passage is clearly not to just describe what the subnivium is. We're introducing climate change and the influence of climate change on the subnivium. So let's talk about that. The formation and stability of the subnivium requires more than a few flurries. A flurry is a short, quick snowstorm, right? So it's not, one snowstorm will not create the subnivium. Right? It requires more than a few. Winter ecologists have suggested that 8 inches of snow is necessary to develop a stable layer of insulation. Now, he introduced the concept of climate change in the previous paragraph, but he is not quite talking about just climate change. So maybe this is more background information we need to get to the climate change point. Let's keep reading. So one thing we know is we need at least 8 inches of snow. Depth is not the only factor, however. More accurately, the stability of the subnivium depends on the interaction between snow depth and snow density. So you need both depth and density. Imagine being under a stack of blankets that are all flattened and pressed together. When compressed, the blankets essentially form one compacted layer. So he's going back to using an analogy with blankets to make his point, right? So when you have a flat layer of all blankets pressed together, it becomes one layer. In contrast, when they are lightly placed on top of one another, their insulative capacity increases because the air pockets between them trap heat. So when you have when there is gaps between the blankets, then they become more, their ability to trap heat is increased. So greater depths of low density snow, you want those gaps, right? The gaps of air pockets will trap heat. So you don't want the snow to be too tightly packed. You want low density snow is better at insulating the ground. So you want high depth, right? So you want greater depth for sure, at least 8 inches, but you want low density. That is the ultimate point he is making here. Both depth and density of snow are sensitive to temperature. Scientists are now beginning to explore how climate change will affect the subnivium as well as the species that depend on it. So he's established that there are two things that matter, depth and density, and now saying that scientists are exploring how climate change affects this. So clearly he's going to talk about climate change's influence on either the snow depth or the snow density or both. At first glance, warmer winters seem beneficial for species that have difficulty surviving sub-zero temperatures. If it doesn't get sub-zero, I don't have to worry about surviving it, right? However, as with most ecological phenomena, the consequences are not so straightforward. So it's not as straightforward as thinking warmth is better. Research has shown that the snow season, the period when snow is more likely than rain, has become shorter since 1970. So when rain falls on snow, it increases the density. Is increasing the density good or bad? It's bad, right? Because we want low density. And reduces its insulative capacity. Therefore, even though winters are expected to become warmer overall from future climate change, the subnivium will tend to become colder and more variable with less protection from the above ground temperatures. So this whole paragraph has been about talking about the influence of climate change on the density of snowfall, right? For one, the snow period, to a certain extent, he's implying that the depth might also not be as good, right? So the snow period has shrunk. So it's not going to snow as long. You may or may not get 8 inches of snow. The rain period has gone up, and when rain falls on snow, snow becomes compacted and dense, and that is not good either. Explicitly, he talks about density, doesn't quite talk about depth, but it seems to be somewhat implied, not quite. We'll go to the next paragraph. The effects of a colder subnivium are complex. For example, shrubs such as crowberry and alpine azalea that grow along the forest floor. So now he's talking about plants and giving an example, tend to block the wind and so retain higher depths of snow around them. So shrubs tend to have higher depths of snow. This captured snow helps to keep the soils insulated, yes, because depth is good, and in turn increases plant decomposition and nutrient release. In field experiments, researchers removed a portion of snow cover to investigate the importance of the subnivium's insulation. So they did an experiment. They removed a portion, and what did they find? They found that soil frost in the snow-free area resulted in damage to plant roots and sometimes even the death of the plant. So then what did they see? They removed some snow to kind of reduce the snow there. And what happens if the snow is reduced or gone? Then the plant roots are damaged. Now, if plant roots are damaged, what happens? It results in the death of the plant. So which means you're no longer going to have shrubs such as the crowberry and the alpine azalea. What happens if you don't have crowberry and alpine azalea? They're no longer going to block the wind and no longer going to retain higher depths of snow. So this time he's talking about the effects. If one plant getting affected, then the whole depth of the snow in the area might get affected. And when depth is affected, subnivium stability is affected. And if the subnivium stability is affected, then all species that depend on it are going to be affected, right? That is the implication of this paragraph to kind of show this chain of effects where affecting one shrub or one plant or one aspect of this subnivium can have an effect on multiple things. All right, we're moving on to the questions. Passage was not that difficult to read, I would say. There are two elements in this passage describing the subnivium and how it works and how animals and plants depend on it, and then the effects of climate change in terms of two things, density and depth of the snow. Depth is good. More depth you have, the better. Density is bad. You don't want a lot of density. You want it to be low dense. Only then will the subnivium have higher constant temperature. Right. Let's look at the questions. What's the purpose of the passage? To talk about the subnivium and to talk about the effects of climate change on the subnivium. Let's look at the options. Introduce readers to a relatively unknown ecosystem, the subnivium. He is doing that. Is that the purpose of the passage? This option mentions nothing about climate change. I would not pick that, right? It's not just about introducing the subnivium and explaining how it works. It's also about explaining how climate change impacts it. Excuse me. Explain how the subnivium works to provide shelter and food to several species. Again, the same reason as the previous option. He does explain how the subnivium works to provide shelter, but that's not our ultimate purpose. We want to talk about climate change. Outline the effects of climate change on the subnivium. Yes, holding on to it. So get the other options. Draw an analogy between the effects of blankets on humans and of snow cover on species living in the subnivium. Does he do this? Yes. Is it his ultimate point? Whole purpose of this passage is to draw that analogy? No. The analogy's purpose was to introduce a subnivium so that we can understand it. We can't relate to the subnivium. If he had directly talked about it, we wouldn't know what he's talking about. But we can relate to using blankets during the winter. So he's using an example that we can understand to kind of make his point, which means the answer for the first question has to be C. We'll move on. All of the following statements are true, except. Okay. So now you want 3 statements that are true and 1 option that is not necessarily true. So we will compare this information with the information given in the passage, identify 3 that are true and eliminate them. So except question, be careful there. Snow depth and snow density both influence the stability of the subnivium. Definitely, this is one of the central points made in the passage. Snow depth and snow density are the important things. It is true, which means we can eliminate it. Climate change has some positive effects on the subnivium. I don't remember reading anything about positive effects. He does say that climate change will lead to a warmer winter, but he also makes the point that warmer winters are not necessarily good because that means there'll be more rain than snow and that the subnivium would actually be impacted. So I'm going to hold on to B. I don't think he says there are any positive effects. We'll come back after we look at the remaining options. The subnivium maintains a steady temperature. Yes, it says constant temperature in the passage, so it's a steady temperature that can be 30 to 40 degrees warmer than the air temperature explicitly stated in the passage. He definitely says that, so we're going to hold on to it. It's there in the second paragraph of the passage. Researchers have established the adverse effects of dwindling snow cover on the subnivium. Yes, he talks about researchers. He's talked about the whole shrub experiment in the last paragraph, and that was to establish an adverse effect. D is definitely true from the passage as well. So I'm going to eliminate it. All of A, C, D are true. He doesn't mention any positive effects on the subnivium specifically, which means the answer has to be B. All right, so we'll move on. I'm checking the chat. Okay, right. Based on this extract, the author would support which one of the following actions? Okay, so here's the thing. The author has not actually recommended any action, right? He's only said climate change is a problem for the subnivium because it affects the snow depth and snow density. Now, this is a question that's asking you to extrapolate. If that is the problem, then which one would the author think as a solution, right? Would support which of the following actions, something that we can possibly do. Which means the answer option that you pick has to tackle the problems that he's discussing. And the only problem he talks about is climate change and its impact on snow depth and snow density. So let's see which options addresses climate change's impact on snow depth and snow density. The use of snow machines in winter to ensure snow cover of at least 8 inches. He's not saying we have to manually go around and filling snow wherever the snow is not sufficient. That doesn't seem to be a valid option. This is a nature-related kind of passage that we're talking about, and climate change is the issue. So using a snow machine is not necessarily a solution. That does not make sense. Government action to curb climate change directly addresses the problem. Passage says climate change is the problem, and B says let's curb climate change. I'm definitely holding on to B, checking out the other options. Adding nutrients to the soil in winter, planting more shrubs in areas of short snow season. As soon as you plant them, will they start growing? The problem with all the other answer options is they are very localized suggestions, right? They are addressing one part and they're basically saying, like, I can do this on my backyard. I can add nutrients to the soil in the winter. Will I be able to do it in every part that has snow cover? That doesn't make any sense. So all the other options are human solutions, not addressing the problem, which is climate change, but bringing in temporary solutions. So A, C, D are to me clearly eliminated, and the only valid answer option for question 3 would be B. I'm moving on. I'm saying that there is a lot of chat happening. Yes, there's comments there, but a lot of it is made by us. So I'm going to move on to question 4. In paragraph 6, the author provides the examples of crowberry and alpine azalea to demonstrate that. Okay, what did we talk about in paragraph 6? Let's recall, right? He talked about the shrubs whose roots help add snow depth because they hold on to the snow, right? But then if you remove the snow, then the shrubs would die, and when the shrubs die, then that means that the roots are damaged, and therefore the shrubs would die, and the nutrients are affected, right? That's the whole point of this last paragraph. Let's look at our options and see which one makes the most sense. Despite frigid temperatures, several species survive in temperate and Arctic regions. The point is not to say that several species survive. The point is to say that several species might not be able to survive. This is not why we are or right now they're surviving is not the point. We've established that in the first paragraph. Here we're talking about the effect of the shrubs in holding on to the snow and protecting or helping the subnivium. Second, we're talking about climate change impacting the roots of the shrubs and therefore preventing or in the future impacting snow depth and snow density. So it's either you talk about the positive effects of the shrubs' roots on the subnivium and the development and the maintenance of the subnivium, or you talk about the climate change effects on the shrubs and damaging them and therefore impacting the subnivium. So it's not about the survival of the species. Due to frigid temperatures in the temperate and Arctic regions, plant species that survive tend to be shrubs rather than trees. Shrubs rather than trees does not make the comparison at all. I'm going to eliminate that option. So A is out. It's not about survival. It's not about shrubs versus trees. These two options are out. The crowberry and alpine azalea are abundant. Again, the point of the whole paragraph. He's not talking about the study to demonstrate that there are lots of alpine azalea in the temperate and Arctic regions. So this option doesn't make sense as well. I'm going to go ahead and eliminate. The stability of the subnivium depends on several interrelated factors, including shrubs on the forest floor. Is definitely a point he's making in the passage, because the shrubs and the roots, it says that they block the wind and retain higher depths of snow around them, and higher depth is good for the stability of the subnivium. So D is definitely a point he's making in the paragraph. So we're going to go with D. Moving on to question 5. Which one of the following statements can be inferred from the passage? It doesn't tell you which part of the passage you are supposed to infer this from. It would have been easier if you had a question that says, when the author talks about snow density, which of the following can be inferred? But let's look at the options. Maybe the options are all from very obvious parts of the passage, or all maybe from the same part of the passage, making your life a little easier to cross-verify the options. In an ecosystem, altering any one element has a ripple effect on all others. Okay, this is true because it talks about how there is as we talked about in the last paragraph, when there is an impact on the azalea, on the shrubs, then that has an impact on the depth. That impacts the stability of the subnivium. If it impacts the stability of the subnivium, it impacts every species that depends on it. Yes, this option is definitely true. I'm going to hold on to it, and I'm going to check the other options. Climate change affects temperate and Arctic regions more than equatorial or arid ones. This is supposed to be Arctic, that's a spelling mistake. Regions more than equatorial or arid ones. We have not made a comparison with equatorial or arid ones. We are not talking about climate change effects on one part of the world. We are talking about the climate change effects on the subnivium. So this is not discussed in the passage. I'm going to eliminate it. A compact layer of wool is warmer than a similarly compact layer of goose down. He has not compared wool and goose down. What he has compared is a compact layer of blanket versus a loose layer of blankets. And he said that a loose layer will capture more air pockets and will trap heat better. So it's compact versus loose layer. That is a comparison. Whereas this answer option talks about compact versus similarly compact. There is no difference in the compactness of the passage, which means we're going to go ahead and eliminate this option as well. Compactness of the blanket, sorry. The loss of the subnivium, while tragic, will affect only, it's not about what it will affect. The point is that in the temperate and the Arctic regions, animals depend a lot on the subnivium. That is why we're talking about those animals and the snow cover and all of that specifically. We're not saying that the loss will affect only those regions. Maybe the loss will continue because the polar bear dies, something else might, some other species in some other equatorial part of the world might get affected as a ripple effect. We have not discussed this at all in the passage. So I'm going to eliminate that. To be the only option that makes sense is A. In an ecosystem, altering any one element has a ripple effect on all others. If you alter one plant species or one layer of the snow or the density of the snow, then every animal that depends on it is going to get affected. A will be your answer. The last question. The author uses blankets as a device too. So in the first paragraph, why does he use the first paragraph example blankets? He does it twice, in the first paragraph and then again in the fourth, fifth paragraph when he talks about the compactness. Now compactness is not an issue. That's in a later paragraph, right? Just like in the first paragraph, he's basically saying, because you can feel the temperature difference out in the air outside and under the blanket, we use the blanket as a refuge. We don't want to come out of it. Similarly, animals, because they can feel the temperature difference outside the snow and under the snow, go inside the snow, right? So it's a comparison between us using blankets and animals using the snow cover to kind of burrow down and stay warm. Right, now let's look at the options. Evoke the bitter cold of winter in the minds of readers. Every place doesn't have to be bitter cold, and he's not trying to evoke bitter cold. He's trying to make us understand how we like to stay warm, right? So it's not A, that wouldn't be the answer. Explain how blankets work to keep us warm. He does that, but that's not the point. The point is to transition to animals. So draw an analogy between blankets and the snowpack. Definitely works for me. I'm gonna hold on to it. Alert readers to the fatal effects of excessive exposure. He's not talking about fatal effects. D does not make sense either, which means pretty much the only option that you're left with is C. And it makes sense. By talking about us burrowing down into blankets and animals burrowing down into the snow, he's making a comparison, which is an analogy between blankets and the snowpack. Works for me? I'm going to go with that.